I thought it was just $13.40, so a boy could leave the Spokane branch with a dog-eared copy of Hatchet. His mom had turned her change purse inside out, cheeks pink, and the line behind us started to breathe impatiently. I told the librarian, add it to mine, signed a little receipt, and on the back I wrote 4 words that felt like a promise. Let him check out the book. I slipped into the drizzle believing I'd never see either of them again. Months later, I'm sitting in a windowless conference room at the Community Foundation, the kind with humming lights and a pitcher of water that tasted like dust, waiting while strangers discuss a decision that could change my year. I glance up and freeze. At the far end of the table is the same librarian. She meets my eyes, tilts her head, and says, softly but clear enough for everyone to hear, I remember what you did. Pens stop, a chair creaks, and I realize a scrap of paper I barely thought about might be the loudest thing in the room. Before I tell you how that moment decided my future, tell me where you're watching from in the comments and follow this page for more true stories. Back then, before that afternoon at the library desk, my life felt like a drawer that wouldn't quite close. I was 32, sleeping on my sister's lumpy pullout in her duplex off Wellesley, trying not to wake her kid when I left for the early shift at the car wash. The place sat on a busy corner where every season smelled different. Pine sap and dust in July, wet rubber and cold metal in January. I kept a sandwich bag of quarters in my glove box and another in my backpack, and some weeks both of them decided what dinner looked like. It wasn't a tragedy, just a slow ache of being stuck. The layoffs at the distribution warehouse had come with a speech about right-sizing, and the box that was somehow too small for everything I'd hoped would fit. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things, but the months ticked by and every application I sent out felt like pouring water into desert sand. I dropped out of community college years earlier when my mom got sick. It was the right thing to do then and the wrong mark to carry now. On paper, I read like unfinished business. The one place that made me feel steady was the downtown library. The first time I walked in after the layoffs, I stood under the high windows a full minute, letting the quiet settle on me like a blanket. The air had that peppery smell of old paper and the sharper note of toner from the copier. People spoke softly, chairs moved gently, and even the cough seemed considerate. There were rules here, and most of them were about giving each other room. I started going most mornings after the car wash, when my shoulders still ached from hoods and fenders. I printed resumes, used the job board, and learned which tables got the best patch of warm sunlight by 10 a.m. I brought a thermos of gas station coffee and pretended it came from somewhere fancy. The librarian at the circulation desk, neat cardigan, hair pinned back, the kind of eyes that actually noticed you, had a voice that could quiet the tight spot between my ribs. She never made anyone feel poor for asking how many pages they could print for free. I wasn't just there to pass time. I had a plan, even if it still felt like a rumor when I said it out loud. Enroll in the HVAC program at Spokane Community College. I liked the practical rhythm of it. Air moving through a system, temperatures balanced, problems you could diagnose with gauges and patience. I'd spent most of my life being the one who could coax a stubborn thing to behave again. An old window, the heater in my sister's car, the temper of a 6-year-old who'd skipped his nap. The idea of learning a trade that made sense to my hands felt like stepping onto a road I could actually walk. The problem wasn't motivation, it was money. Even a community college bill might as well be Mount Rainier if rent and groceries are already a climb. I did the math 5 different ways and came up short 6 different times. Then a tutoring flyer tacked to the corkboard caught my eye. Adult Learner Scholarship, Community Foundation, applicants with demonstrated commitment and financial need. I took a picture of it with my cracked phone and stood there a minute, trying to imagine my name on a check that size. Hope can embarrass you if you're not careful. The application wasn't complicated, but it demanded things I wasn't used to giving. A personal statement that didn't apologize for itself, 2 letters of recommendation from people who'd actually seen me try, and a plan for the next 2 years that sounded like a life instead of a wish. I carried a cheap folder with my drafts and forms like it was breakable. I wrote the statement at a table near the big windows, rewriting every sentence until it sounded less like begging and more like truth. I told them about the layoff, about my mother's illness years back, about the pride that kept me from asking for help until it was too late. I told them what I wanted from the HVAC program and what I'd give in return.
Steady work, steady presence, steady service. Finding people to vouch for me took its own courage. The manager at the car wash who'd watched me show up on time, even when a February wind could cut through your jacket like a knife, agreed to write. So did my sister's neighbor, a retired maintenance tech who had once let me borrow his tools and stood in the driveway like a drill sergeant while I changed out her dryer belt. The third letter came from a place I didn't expect. The pastor at the little church down the street, where my nephew's after-school program met. He'd seen me set up chairs and stay late to stack them again, not because anyone asked, but because I couldn't stand leaving a room worse than I found it. Every piece of the application lived at that library table for a while. I learned the rhythm of the printer, the squeak of the hole punch, the small triumph of a staple going in straight. When my hands shook, I took a lap past the children's section, where the shelves were low and the artwork was gentle. Crayon suns, wobbly letters, a paper chain that looked like courage in colors. The librarian would sometimes look up as I passed and ask if I'd found everything I needed, and I'd nod too fast, because the truthful answer was complicated. I needed so many things the library couldn't loan. That afternoon with the boy and the overdue fees didn't feel like part of my plan. It didn't feel like anything at all beyond a little mercy I could afford. $13.40 was 2 bus rides and a coffee, but the hurt on that kid's face when the screen flashed red reached me in a place deeper than a budget. I remembered being 10 and wanting to check out a book about a dog so badly it made my chest ache, and the way the clerk had said, "Come back with your mom," like I was a problem to be sent somewhere else. When I told the librarian to add the fee to mine, I braced for a lecture about policy, about fairness, about the waiting list behind us. Instead, she just studied my face for a second, like she could see me tracing the math in my head. And then she turned the monitor and tapped a few keys. The receipt curled out warm from the little machine. I signed, flipped it over, and wrote the sentence that felt right in my hand. Let him check out the book. I didn't add my number or a hashtag or a moral. I don't know why I wrote it down at all, except that I wanted those words to exist somewhere other than my throat. The boy hugged the book like it might try to run away. His mom kept murmuring, "Thank you," in a voice that sounded like it had had a long winter. I backed into the drizzle and thought about how sometimes the only way to keep yourself from sinking is to put your weight under somebody else for a second. I walked to the bus stop, feeling a little foolish and a little lighter. I went home, added the expense to my budget in shaky numbers, and set my alarm for the next morning like always. What I didn't know then was that the scholarship committee met in the same building where the community foundation kept its offices, and that the librarian with the careful eyes volunteered there twice a month. I didn't know that the folder I kept pressed flat inside my backpack would end up on a table where she sat, or that she would recognize the name on the signature line because it matched the one curled at the bottom of a small, forgettable receipt. I only knew that the next day I opened my email and saw an invitation to a finalist interview with 3 people whose opinions suddenly felt larger than the city itself. The invite gave me 3 days to get ready. I ironed the one good shirt I owned on my sister's kitchen table, using a towel because the ironing board hinge had snapped years ago. Her neighbor, Mr. Kramer, stood in the doorway coaching me through a knot that wasn't the lopsided one I usually wore to weddings and court dates. My nephew pressed a copper penny into my palm, the kind with a scratch through Lincoln's face, and told me it was lucky if I kept it heads up. I slipped it into my wallet behind my library card and tried not to let my hands shake. The morning of the interview was the color of dishwater. I took the bus downtown and walked the last 4 blocks to save the transfer, shoes catching tiny stones that clicked on the lobby floor of the community foundation. The woman at the front desk gave me a badge with my name printed slightly crooked. I sat on a vinyl chair that sighed when I moved and watched the second hand stutter across a clock that had seen too many pauses. The hallway smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. They called me in with the kind of smiles that say, "We're here to listen, but we're also here to decide." There were 4 people at the table. The chair introduced herself first, a woman with an efficient bob and a wedding band that had seen years. Next was a high school counselor with sleeves rolled to her elbows and ink stains on her fingers. Beside her sat a man who owned a local hardware store, the kind of guy who probably knew the name of every snow shovel in his inventory. And at the end, hands folded over a legal pad, was the librarian from the branch. Hair pinned back, cardigan a soft gray. My stomach climbed up into my throat. We shook hands. Her grip was steady and warm. "Good to see you," she said. And then, soft enough that only the room could hear it, "I remember what you did." The chair glanced at her curious, but the librarian just opened her notebook and waited. I took the seat they offered and pretended my heart wasn't trying to crack a rib. They started with the easy questions that aren't easy when your future is stapled to them. Why HVAC? What changed since you left school the first time? Who's in your corner? I told them the truth in plain words, that I liked the way a system tells you the story of what's wrong if you listen, that I'd left school when my mother got sick and never got my feet fully under me again, that my sister had made room on a pullout so I could climb back. I talked about shifts at the car wash and learning to time my coffee so the caffeine hit when courage ran low. The hardware store owner leaned forward. "It's hard work," he said. "Long days. Cold crawl spaces in winter, hot roofs in August. You sure you want that?" I nodded. He watched my face, like he was waiting for a flinch. "And math," he added. "Not fancy math, real math. Numbers you can't fake." "I've been practicing," I said. "Mr. Kramer across the hall used to do maintenance at the hospital. He's been making me do conversions until I see BTUs in my sleep." The counselor smiled at that, and for a second, the tight band around my ribs loosened. Then came the questions that snag. Your credit history is thin. Your savings are thinner. How will you pay rent when classes start? What happens if your sister needs her couch back? Why now, not 2 years ago? I had answers. Part-time weekend shifts, a friend with a room I could rent by the month, a budget that squeaked but didn't scream. Still, I could feel the room measuring not just my plan, but the space between my plan and the edge of a cliff. The librarian didn't rescue me. She didn't have to. She asked one question and it wasn't soft. When the work gets dull, what keeps you from quitting? I thought about the car wash in February, the way your fingers go numb and then burn, and how the only thing that got me through the last hour was the idea that someone would drive away able to see out of their world again. I told her that. She made a mark with her pen and looked satisfied in a way that made me sit a little taller. They thanked me. The chair used the words I expected. "We'll be in touch." I walked out into the hallway and sat on the same vinyl chair with the same sigh. My shirt stuck to my back. On the wall opposite me was a framed poster with a quote about opportunity that sounded like it had never missed a meal. I tried to breathe like someone who believed in process. A man in a dark blazer walked past and let the conference room door swing almost closed. Almost. Through the narrow gap, I heard it. The chair's voice, low and clipped. "We're split." Another voice said, "The GPA's just stronger." Another, "But he's got grit." The hardware store owner grunted something I couldn't make out. And in the chair again, "We can table to next quarter." The door latched. I stared at the floor until the pattern in the carpet turned into tiny islands. My mouth tasted like copper. Table to next quarter meant rent coming due before hope did. It meant telling my sister I tried, and watching the tired behind their eyes deepen by a shade. It meant the plan turning back into a rumor. The librarian stepped into the hallway a minute later to refill the pitcher. She didn't look surprised to see me still there. "There's a bakery across the street," she said, not breaking any rules. "They do a cheese roll that makes bad news soften." I almost laughed. "I don't know the news yet," I said. "No," she agreed. "You don't." I walked outside because sitting still felt like agreeing with something I didn't agree with. The air had shifted, the drizzle sharpened into a fine, insistent rain that stitched the street into a kind of gray cloth. I stood under the awning and watched the woman in scrubs hurry past, shoes squeaking. The bakery window glowed with warm light and a small crowd. I didn't go in. I didn't want to owe myself comfort until the world owed me a reason. When they called me back 15 minutes later, there were 2 empty styrofoam cups on the table and a new smell in the room. the brief, sweet ghost of something baked. The chair folded her hands. "We appreciate your time," she began, which is what people say before they tell you to try again next season. The hardware store owner looked at his notes. The counselor's mouth had the tight line of someone bracing for an argument they'd already lost. The librarian cleared her throat. "Before we wrap," she said, voice steady, "I need to put something on the record. I won't vote and I won't recommend outside the criteria, but I can share what I witnessed in my role at the library because it speaks to character, which your rubric includes." The chair looked at her, surprised but not annoyed. "Go ahead." She told them about a gray Tuesday afternoon, about a boy with a worn-out library card and a book he wanted more than he could explain, about a mom counting coins and the screen flashing overdue fees. She told them about a man in a car wash polo who stepped forward and said, "Add it to mine," and about a receipt that came out warm from the little machine. "He signed it," she said, "and on the back he wrote, 'Let him check out the book.' He didn't put his number, didn't wait for thanks. He just left." No one spoke for a breath or two. The hardware store owner tapped his pen once, then stopped. The counselor's shoulders lowered like a string had been cut. The chair looked at the librarian. "It's a nice story," she said, carefully, "but we can't award based on nice stories." "I agree," the librarian said. "It's not evidence of skills. It's a snapshot of who he is when no one is watching. You already have his plan, his letters, his grades from the courses he finished before life happened. Our rubric has a line for community contribution and integrity. I am saying I've seen his name attached to both." The hardware store owner exhaled through his nose. "A receipt isn't a resume," he said, but his voice had changed. "Still, in my world, the guy who pays attention to the small things is the guy I send into a customer's house. He doesn't just fix the unit. He notices the loose hinge on the back gate and mentions it. That's how you build a business." He looked at the chair. "I could mentor him one Saturday a month. Get him in a shop to see the guts of it, if that matters." The chair glanced at the counselor, who was already nodding. The counselor said, "We weighted the community section lower than we meant to. We can revisit that. The difference in GPA is marginal. His statement is stronger, and he has a concrete plan with support." They asked me back in for one final question. The chair met my eyes. "If we award you this," she said, "can you commit to giving 2 hours a week back to the library or the program? Tutoring, reading with kids, coming back next year to talk to applicants about not giving up." My yes came out before she finished the sentence. The hardware store owner added, "If you're willing, I'll have you shadow a tech once a month. No guarantees, just a chance to see the work." I said yes to that too, trying not to sound like I was agreeing to oxygen. They sent me out again, and the door closed, and the second hand on the hallway clock took a full 10 years to move. When it did, the chair opened the door herself. She didn't make me sit back down. "Congratulations," she said. The vote tipped. The counselor smiled with her whole face. The hardware store owner shook my hand like we had already moved a furnace together. The librarian didn't step forward. She just nodded, the smallest nod, like two people who had both chosen the same quiet rule were acknowledging it. The envelope arrived at my sister's place 3 days later, thick and official, with the kind of paper that feels like something real. Tuition and books for the first year, a small stipend for tools. I read it twice, and then once out loud to the empty living room. Tucked inside was a sticky note in neat, careful handwriting. "I remember what you did. Make good on it." I didn't need a signature to know whose hand wrote it. The first week of classes smelled like metal shavings and coffee. In the lab, we learned how to bend duct without kinking it, how to listen for a refrigerant leak with more than your ears, how a system can choke on something as small as neglect. My hands looked like they belonged to someone who worked for a living by the second Friday. Small cuts, a bruise across the knuckle, a smudge that didn't wash off and didn't need to. On Saturdays, I still did shifts at the car wash. On Thursdays, I kept the promise. The library had me reading with second graders under the big skylight, where the light puddled gold in the late afternoon. The boy from the felines showed up on my second week, taller by an inch and carrying a book with taped corners. He slid into the chair across from me without asking, like we'd saved each other a seat and just arrived late. "I finished that one," he said, tapping the cover of Hatchet. "This is the next one." He met Brian's Winter. I smiled because it felt like I knew something about both. His mom waited near the shelves, hand on the strap of her bag, eyes softer than the day I first saw her. She mouthed, "Thank you," and I shook my head because we both understood we were part of something that didn't need a spotlight to count. The librarian passed our table and touched the edge of the desk with 2 fingers like she was checking that it was still steady. Behind her, pinned up beside the monitor, was a small receipt, yellowed at the edges. On the back, in my slanted handwriting, "Let him check out the book." I went home after those Thursdays with a quiet that didn't come from exhaustion. It came from belonging to a program, to a room with low shelves, to a future that required both hands and a good heart. The scholarship didn't fix everything. The bus still ran late, bills still stacked up like misbehaving dominoes, and the work left me sore in places I hadn't known were mine. But at night, when I set out my thermos and my notebook, I felt the world tilt, just a little, in the direction of okay. If you've ever had a small kindness find its way back to you, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments what happened and where you're watching from. Follow this page for more true stories like this, because the good we pass along has a way of finding a seat at our table when we need it most. The quiet didn't mean easy. 2 weeks into the semester, I bombed the quiz so badly my face went hot just seeing the grade. I sat in the campus parking lot with my elbows on the steering wheel and thought about calling the number on the back of the scholarship letter to tell them they'd made a mistake. Instead, I walked to the library, because when I don't know what to do, I go where books live. The librarian listened, the way she does, and slid a sheet across the counter with tutoring hours on a list of practice problems. "You don't have to be brilliant," she said. "You have to be stubborn." Stubborn I could do. Mr. Kramer ran me through conversions at his kitchen table 3 nights a week, a mug of black coffee standing guard over every fraction. At the shop on Saturdays, the hardware store owner, who finally told me to call him Flotus, let me shadow a tech. The first service call we took together was to a drafty little rental where the furnace clicked but wouldn't catch. The air in the living room had that cold metallic taste that makes your teeth hurt. We traced the blockage, cleared a tired igniter, and got heat moving again. As we packed up, I noticed the back gate sagging on one screw. It took me 90 seconds to set it right. The tenant, a woman in scrubs who smelled like laundry at midnight, said, "Nobody ever fixes the little things." She meant more than a hinge.
During the next ride-along, Flores watched me more than the system. "You keep your eyes open," he said, "not as praise, as fact. Keep doing that. People notice." He was right. A week later, the tenant sent his shop a note thanking the quiet kid who fixed my heat and my gate. Flores left it on the counter for me to find. Paper, again. I was starting to believe in the kind you can hold. At home, life kept wobbling. My sister's hours got cut. The couch needed to be a couch again. I spent 2 nights on a friend's floor and then saw a card pinned to the library corkboard. Room for rent, basement, month to month, no smoking. The landlord turned out to be the aunt of one of the Thursday readers. She looked me up and down, asked more questions than a loan application, and then nodded like she had already decided back when she watched me point at words with 2nd graders under the skylight. The rent fit in the numbers I'd scribbled on an envelope. The room smelled faintly of old paint and relief. Midterms arrived. I passed by more than a hair. On Thursdays, the boy brought me new books, corners taped, pride taped over the places where pride had once cracked. His mom started lingering a little longer, asking about classes like she was auditing my life. One afternoon, the librarian slipped a thin paperback onto our table, an extra copy of a manual for basic home repairs, the kind written clean enough for anyone to use. "For when the world hands you a hinge," she said. The boy laughed. It felt like our joke. In April, the Community Foundation held a small gathering for scholarship recipients. Donors in sweaters, a tray of cookies, coffee in those thick white cups that chip along the rim. I wore the same iron shirt and a tie that almost remembered its knot. The chair asked if I'd say a few words about what the award made possible. I'm better at ducks than microphones, but I stood up anyway. I told him the truth, that the money mattered, yes, but the thing that changed me was the sense that a room full of strangers had voted for my future. I didn't hold up the receipt. I don't like props. I said the words instead. Let him check out the book. The librarian stood near the back, next to the coffee urn, eyes shining the way light shines on a lake when the wind is low. When I sat down, Flores clapped twice as loud as the room and pretended not to. By summer, I was sleeping like a person instead of a knot. The bus still ran late, rent still hunched its shoulders at me every first of the month, but the shape of my days had changed. Class, lab, work, library, home. I took the EPA exam with a stomach full of B's and walked out with a pass that felt like a new last name. Flores handed me a secondhand tool bag with my initials burnt into the leather and said, "You'll fill it slow. That's how you do it right." The next week, we took a service call out near Hilliard, a grandfather who'd been too proud to call until the house was colder than his bones. We swapped out a capacitor, brushed dust from places dust shouldn't be, and I tested the carbon monoxide detector because Mr. Kramer's voice lived in my head now, and he taught me to check the thing that saves a life first. The old man watched me like he was deciding if I was the kind of person who could be trusted with a screwdriver and a secret. When warm air finally sighed through the vents, he closed his eyes and said, "That's the sound my wife liked." He wrote a thank you note to the foundation, not because he had to, but because people from certain generations put gratitude on paper. The chair forwarded it to me with a smiley face she probably didn't mean to pick. Paper again. In August, the library hosted a back-to-school night. I volunteered to help kids pick out their first day book, something they could carry into a classroom like a shield and a key. The boy, taller and all elbows, chose a biography about an astronaut and told me he wanted to build things you couldn't see but could feel. Air that cools, heat that holds. I said, "Me too." And we both looked up at the skylight like space began there. A few days later, the librarian waved me over to the desk. "We're starting a repair clinic," she said. "Little things, lamps, loose chairs, wobbly wheels. People bring what's broken. You help them fix it. We'll sign off your volunteer hours and keep bad furniture out of the landfill." It sounded like the best kinds of magic. Not trickery, just patience. On the first Saturday, the meeting room filled with objects that had stories. Teapots whose lids no longer fit, a floor fan that rattled like a joke, a suitcase that refused to remember it was meant to open and close. I showed a 10-year-old how to tighten a screw without stripping it. His mom hugged me like I'd saved the semester. Through all of it, the receipt stayed pinned beside the librarian's monitor. Edges curled, ink a little paler. Once I asked if she'd like me to copy it, frame it, do something to save it before time erased it. She shook her head. "It's supposed to wear out," she said. "It's a working document." I think she meant kindness should look handled. Fall brought a cold snap that made everything feel brittle. I was out on a job when my phone buzzed with a number I recognized from the foundation. For a second, my chest went hollow. The chair's voice was warm. "We had a donor add funds for continuation awards," she said. "Students who've kept grades up and kept giving back. The committee voted. You're in." I sat on the back step of a duplex and stared at the frost on the railing like it was fireworks. "Also," she added, "someone sent us a copy of a note you wrote and a paragraph about a hinge. I didn't ask who. I didn't have to." On the Thursday near Thanksgiving, the boy plopped into the chair across from me with a grin that looked too big for his face. He said, "They're letting me help pick books for the winter display. Miss Reyes says I have opinions." I told him opinions were just facts wearing their favorite jacket, and he laughed like he might try that line on someone else. We read for 20 minutes. When his mom came to get him, she pressed a folded paper into my hand. A drawing of me holding a wrench done in green marker. Underneath, in lopsided letters, "Thank you for the heat and the books." I keep that drawing in the same folder as my certification and my class schedule and the letter with the sticky note that says, "I remember what you did." When bad days come, and they do, with blown fuses and customers who shout and bills that refuse to behave, I take the folder out and touch each page like I'm counting a rosary. A few months later,
The dollar menu lost one of its dollars, and winter showed up 2 weeks early. Spokane does this thing where November pretends it's January, and everyone remembers which windows leak cold like a bad secret. The repair clinic at the library turned into a parade of space heaters and shivering lamps. On a Saturday, a woman brought in a humidifier shaped like a penguin that made a noise halfway between a cough and a laugh. I took it apart on the folding table while second graders watched like I was digging up treasure. When the penguin finally sighed properly, the kids clapped. Nobody taught them to do that, which made it count more.
The semester rolled on. I missed a bus one morning and arrived to a lab quiz with my lungs still chewing on the cold. I scraped a pass by the width of a hair and felt the old fear tug at my sleeve, the sense that one mistake means the whole tower falls. That night, I went to the library and did conversions until the numbers stopped slipping around. The librarian left a peppermint on the corner of my table and didn't say a word. Peppermints are the quietest kind of vote. Then came a letter taped to the library's front door. Budget proposal. Consideration to reduce hours at 3 branches. People read it with their mouths pressed thin. The library is a place where people go when rent is due and electricity is due and kindness is due. Cutting hours felt like deciding some days mattered less. The librarian looked smaller behind the desk. She never complains, so you have to learn to read the way her cardigan buttons pull when she's stressed. I told Flores about the notice during a ride-along, and he said what men like him say when the world shrinks something they love. Who do I talk to? The answer was the city council, in a meeting room with bad microphones and folding chairs that pinched the backs of your legs. The library posted the date. The foundation circulated it in a plain email with a subject line that didn't panic. The librarian didn't ask anyone to show up. She didn't have to. On the night of the meeting, the bakers, the bus drivers, the after-school kids, the woman with the penguin humidifier, everybody carried in their own version of proof. The boy and his mom sat in the second row. He had on a collared shirt that somehow kept forgetting to behave. I stood near the wall and tried to breathe past the lump in my throat. The chair at the front, a man whose tie leaned left, called for public comment. People stepped to the microphone with papers in their hands because paper is how you tell the truth when you want it to be heard properly. I didn't plan to speak. Then the boy's mom nudged me, a gentle shove between the shoulder blades, and there I was, at the microphone with my heart drumming like a dryer full of quarters. I told them how a scholarship had kept my life from wobbling off its axis, how that scholarship came from a room that included a librarian who volunteers her time when nobody's clapping, and how a branch like ours catches people before they fall through the cracks big systems pretend aren't there. I didn't say anything about a receipt. It felt too small for a room that big. When I stepped back, the boy tugged at his shirt and looked up at his mom, and then he walked to the microphone like a kid who's decided to be brave exactly long enough. His voice was small, the kind that makes adults lean forward without meaning to. He said, "Once I didn't have enough, and they let me check out the book. Now I have enough. Please don't make the hours shorter." He didn't cry. He didn't have to. He held up a piece of paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a page he'd written in pencil, crooked lines, eraser ghosts. "Let me check out the book." Someone behind me sniffed. Flores cleared his throat in a way that meant if he spoke next, he'd sound different than he'd like to sound. The council asked questions about numbers, because numbers look tidy in minutes. A budget officer talked about costs and efficiencies and things that pretend to have no faces. But the room had faces, and the faces made a sound that budgets don't understand. Small yeses, the kind people make when they're counting something precious. The vote didn't happen that night. Government moves like a glacier and calls it caution. Still, when we filed out, the librarian's shoulders looked an inch higher. She squeezed the boy's hand and mouthed "thank you" to me like the words were a bird she didn't want to scare away. 2 weeks later, the foundation sent out an update, a revised proposal that kept our branch hours intact. A council member wrote a paragraph about community testimony that articulated the essential, non-quantifiable services provided by our libraries, which is a fancy way of saying the room mattered. The librarian didn't celebrate. She stacked chairs after story time and watered the snake plant by the front window. The receipt stayed pinned by her monitor, edges a little more tired, like it had stayed up late to help. I finished the term higher than I started. Florida's put me on payroll for weekend calls, which meant the tool bag got heavier and my bank account stopped looking like an emergency waiting to happen. He taught me the way a furnace complains before it quits, and how to hear the difference between a customer who needs an explanation and a customer who needs 30 seconds of silence first. He kept his promise about monthly mentoring, and sometimes he'd make me ring the doorbell and do the talking while he stood back and watched like a dad at a driver's test, pretending he wasn't pressing an invisible brake. In the spring, the library repair clinic got busy enough to need signups. The boy, now too tall for the word boy, started volunteering, teaching smaller hands how to hold a screwdriver without turning it into a weapon. He'd look over at me sometimes with a grin that said we were in on the same secret, that fixing a lamp lets you believe bigger fixes are possible. One afternoon, he showed up with a chipped wooden chair and a proud look. "It wobbles," he said. "I want it to be a reading chair." We sanded and glued and clamped and waited. When we finally set it down and it didn't wobble anymore, he sat on it like he'd just invented sitting. He wrote "read" on the back slat in blue paint and left a thumbprint dot above the A on accident. He didn't fix it. He said it was his signature. Summer brought heat that makes asphalt look like it wants to be water. Work picked up. I came home every night with the smell of attic dust stuck to my skin and the satisfaction you can't buy at any store. On a Tuesday that felt like a stove, Flores handed me an envelope with my name on it again. Continuation award confirmed, plus a small stipend for tools if I kept volunteering. "Looks like your library likes you," he said. "I like them back," I said, and we both pretended to be busy with something else. There were still bad days. A compressor blew like a temper. A customer blamed me for a part older than his mortgage. I missed the bus, then an exam review, and watched a letter grade wobble. On one of those nights, I walked to the library even though my legs said no. The building glowed like it always does. Not bright, just steady. The librarian was shelving returns. She doesn't usually talk about herself, but she said, "My first job was at a circulation desk in a town where our biggest donor didn't like kids touching the glass doors. I stayed anyway." I asked why. She said because other people's ideas of what a place is for shouldn't be the final word. Somewhere between summer and fall, I stopped keeping my alarm clock on the loud setting. I didn't need to wake up scared anymore. I was still broke in the way students are broke, but it was the kind of broke that comes with a ladder. I kept a new ritual on Thursdays before the reading hour started. I'd break a 20 at the front desk and slide $13.40 into the old candy jar the friends of the library use for donations. It wasn't earmarked. Money that moves doesn't always need a label. The librarian never made a face about it, which is to say she made it safe to keep doing it. Near the end of the year, the foundation asked if I'd sit on a panel for new applicants, just to answer questions, not to vote. I almost said no because I don't like pretending to be an expert. Then I remembered how the room felt when I was the one asking for a future. I said yes. The night of the panel, I wore the iron shirt and the tie that now knew it's not without coaching. People asked about grades and jobs and time and children and fear. I told them the truth, that you don't have to be fearless, just honest and stubborn. That a plan doesn't protect you, but it gives you a thing to hold. That if you can't lift your own hope for a minute, go to a place that has some in stock and borrow theirs. After the Q&A, a woman lingered by the doorway, twisting her wedding ring the way people do when they're trying to decide if bravery is worth the trouble. She says she hadn't been in a classroom since the year her second child was born, that she cried when printers jammed because that's what printers are for, and that her husband worked nights and sometimes her courage did too. I told her the library had a tutoring sheet with hours that actually happened and a table near the window that saved me more than once. I told her about the peppermint. She laughed without showing her teeth and said she'd be there Tuesday. Graduation day smelled like starch and gym floor. Not the cap and gown kind,
just a certificate ceremony in a room with too much echo. Florida sat in the audience wearing a collared shirt that looked like it had negotiated a truce with him. Mr. Kramer was there too, with a thermos and the posture of a man who won't admit he's proud. My sister cried in a way that makes you want to look away and look harder. When they called my name, it sounded like a door opening. I shook hands, took the paper, and looked down at the seal impressed in the corner. Paper, again. I folded it carefully, not like it might break, but like it might want to be treated the way I wish people treated each other, without hurry. I walked to the library before I went home. The boy was in the teen section, taller than me now, arguing gently with a friend about which book started slow in the best possible way. The librarian stood at the desk with a stack of returns that looked like a measure of faith. I asked if the community foundation would let me set aside a tiny fund. Nothing with a name yet, just a line item for fee forgiveness when a kid needs a book and a screen says no. She said, "We already have a process." I said, "I know. I want to be part of it." She looked at me the way she looked at me the day she told the committee my name belonged beside the word character, then nodded. "We'll call it the receipt," she said, like it made perfect sense. Not because it proves purchase, because it proves presence. I don't pretend the world changed because $13.40 moved from one pocket to a library till. The world changed because people kept showing up to vote, sometimes with ballots and sometimes with minutes of their lives. Kindness, it turns out, is a system you can learn like HVAC. Air moves, heat travels, pressure equalizes, and if one duct is blocked, the room on the far end goes cold. You find the blockage, you clear it, you check again. So here's me, at the end of a long story that isn't really an end. I work with my hands. I show up at the library on Thursdays. I keep a copy of a note in my wallet. Let him check out the book. When I hand it to someone new, it isn't advice. It's a reminder that we are all, eventually, on both sides of a counter. If you stayed with me this far, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and the small, ordinary kindness that tipped a vote in your life. And follow this page for more true stories, because the good you send out has a stubborn way of circling back exactly when you need it.